So science communication, why is it important, and why should we do it, and how should we do it? These are a few personal reflections from me. There are a number of reasons why we should communicate our science. Firstly, we might have to do it as a requirement of our funding. We may communicate our science as part of student recruitment. But ultimately, I think we should communicate our science because it's the right thing to do. We are, after all, a curious species, always asking questions about the world. As scientists, we're privileged to be able to find things out, and we have an obligation to the taxpayer who funds us to tell people about what we find. If we don't communicate what we've done, we might as well have not done it. So who is our science communication for? Well, it's for everybody, but the different audiences require different approaches and styles. A scientific paper is a communication to our peers, but it's a core message being as important and interesting to both. So the first thing to do is to define your audience and understand their motivation for being present and listening to you. It's just really storytelling. As scientists, we often communicate formally, revealing our conclusions right at the end of a paper or a talk. Non-scientific audiences are not receptive to this approach, and you need to have a clear outcome or punchline in mind. It's a good idea to give away the punchline right at the beginning and then work towards it during the talk so the audience know where you're going. Don't pull a rabbit out of the hat right at the end. There may be a lot of pieces of information, assumptions and context that as a scientist you feel the need to tell people about as you develop your story. But don't do this. Think about the key thing that you want the audience to take away. A useful strategy is to challenge yourself to identify one thing you want somebody to remember about your presentation later, maybe a year later. Use this as your core message and repeat it throughout the talk. Another way to identify the core idea of your talk, particularly if you've got a PhD, is to try and think about tweeting your thesis. You will have spent 3 or 4 years of blood, sweat and tears developing that 50,000 words summarising your studies. Very few people are going to read that all the way through, let alone a lay audience. Can you give the key point of your thesis that is short enough for a tweet? Mine will be that cell expansion results in the growth of plant roots and is driven by the high pressures in the cells, but that the rate of growth is determined by how easily the cell wall extends under pressure. It's actually quite depressing to distill all that work into one sentence. However, communicating one thing clearly is better than communicating nothing at all. Be clear in your language. If you've ever had to write a lay abstract, the biggest mistake people make is simply translating the technical text into apparently lay language. Not only are the words that you use different, but the fundamental way that you tell the story needs to be different. The reason for your study needs to be translated into people's real lives. This might be straightforward if you're looking for a cure for cancer, for example, as the impact is immediate and obvious. People in the audience may have had cancer or certainly know somebody who has. But what if you're studying gravitational waves or even the motif of rainfall in the novels of Jane Eyre? Search for actual impact in the real world for those people that they will recognise in their day-to-day lives. What might this work actually lead to? What has it already delivered? While for some topics this might be difficult, as long as it's interesting, people will engage with it. It might be that you're having to explain complex ideas, and using analogies can be a really good way of getting around this if you can identify a good one. For example, the operation of stomatal guard cell pores on plant cells is the complex interplay between the anesotropic cell wall properties and the reversible thermodynamics that regulate water flow and sow turgor pressure. Complicated, but accurate. An alternative is to explain the hydraulics of stomatal opening using a balloon and some sellotape. A direct demonstration like this is always good for a live audience. If you can't demonstrate it directly, a clear description of the analogy is also good. Cavitation due to cohesion tension in the xylem can be explained with the analogy of cracking one's knuckles, or the sound that a kettle makes when just on the boil. And the xylem itself can easily be demonstrated with the slinky. I use a slinky for lots of different demonstrations. As part of the storytelling, it's really important to put yourself into the story. That will really engage people. An aside, apparently, unrehearsed, can go down really well, breaking down the fourth wall and bringing the audience in. I often tell a story in my own research when late at night in the lab, looking at the output from a spectrophotometer, I'm seeing the readings of each sample rising, getting more and more exciting as my hypothesis comes true as I'd predicted. I talk about that excitement I felt at that initial success and being the only person in the world who knew something new that nobody else knew. Describing the excitement of science at a particular moment can be very engaging to an audience, making science more accessible and real. If you're confident and you have a good story to tell, you can give an engaging presentation without any visuals. However, an engaging PowerPoint can also be good, but try and avoid any text and certainly no graphs. If you do include a graph, take the time and care to explain to the audience what the graph shows and reassure them that the bits of the data you don't want them to bother with. Consider whether a picture not directly illustrating the point you're making could make part of that presentation more appealing. Remember, if you put up any text, there will be people who look at that and spend less time actually listening to you. These are some slides that I used about climate change in Dubai and introducing the Bifor face. Here you can see I'm able to talk to my points about different ecosystems and the structure of the Bifor research without any great recourse to lots of text. And in these diagrams, when I'm showing lots of text in this case, I would tell the audience to ignore that. The main point there is the interaction between things. Adding a video can also be good if you have a longer presentation, breaking up the delivery and giving the audience a break. Here are some examples of mine. This is the top of the canopy, 35 meters from the ground. Very rarely do researchers get to go this high. But this is where the sunlight is. This is where these leaves will be the most efficient, have the most energy to do that photosynthesis. So this is where the questions have to be asked. Engaging the audience with questions is also a good technique. Asking them questions, listening to their answers gives them ownership and they become part of the presentation. Considering using the teacher's trick of think, pair, share. Ask an audience a question, ask them to talk to their neighbours and then flag up that you'll be asking for some feedback. Give them time, for example, say, I'll give you 2 minutes to think about this. This makes it non-threatening and they're clear about what's going to happen. Whatever form your presentation takes, be honest. Don't be overly formal and include yourself. While you may be the expert, it's okay and exciting, perhaps, for the audience to hear you say we don't know something. This emphasises that science is not necessarily about answers all the time, but more about questions. We are, after all, an inquisitive species, and we should share our own inquisitiveness about our science with the public. Most of all, it's an enjoyable dialogue, and I hope these tips have been helpful.